Hello everybody and welcome to EWAR 101, that is Electronic Warfare 101. Today we'll be discussing these EWAR frigates and we will learn the mechanics, how they work, what they do, and learn about the ships that you use to fly EWAR. This is going to be focusing pretty much strictly on T1 EWAR frigates. We'll not be talking about the cruisers or the T2 electronic attack ships very much today. It's just going to be focused on the new bro-friendly T1 EWAR frigates. Start off with the very basics. What is electronic warfare? Well, essentially electronic warfare is used in fleets to, rather than do direct damage to enemies, it is used to reduce their effectiveness in combat, indirectly. This is targeting different systems, and we'll go over each specific type individually, but your goal is to support the fleet rather than doing the damage up front. A force multiplier is the term that's commonly used. So to that end, let's talk about the first type, and I'm going to go from most simple to kind of most complicated. They're not too complicated at all. It's just some are much simpler than others. So we're going to start with the most simple type, and that would be target painting. So if you take a look in Fleet Chat there, I have linked a Target Painter 1 module. And what target painting does is it affects an enemy ship's signature radius. And I'm going to use an analogy. We'll see how this works. It's the first time I've tried using it. But just to kind of simplify all the game mechanics down into one simple idea, when you use an analogy of, say, something like a machine gunner in a traditional war, a machine gunner nest sitting atop a wide open field looking for targets, right? Imagine that's a ship in this game. So what a target painter is doing by modifying the enemy ship's signature radius is it's basically shining a spotlight towards the targets. It's making the targets bigger and more obvious to see. And the actual effect in game that this has is, one, it will make your fleet's guns hit that target easier. You know, imagine a machine gunner can see the targets much better. He can shoot at them more accurately, right? Number two, it allows your fleet ships to lock onto those ships faster as targets. Again, spotlight on a target in the field. Hey, he's over there. Lock onto him, shoot him, right? Now, the ship that is bonus to using target painters is the Vigil. And if you open up that and go to traits, you'll see that it has 7.5% bonus to effectiveness, 10% bonus to range per level in Minmatar frigates. Target painters are probably the most long range of all the EWAR types. You can easily get beyond 100 kilometers with target painter, and I should say that, as with a lot of the guns in this game, EWAR modules are affected by optimal and fall off range, and we'll talk about how that comes into play a little later. That's pretty much all there is to target painters. Do we have any questions about target painters at this point? Okay, so moving on to the next type of EWAR would be remote sensor dampening. You'll notice in the Fleet Chat I've linked an example of one of those modules. If you want to go to the Attributes tab of that window, you'll see that the bonuses that dampening provides as standard are a reduction in maximum targeting range and scan resolution. So targeting range is pretty straightforward. It's how far away can you lock a ship. If we go back to our analogy with the machine gunners, how far can you see, basically? How far can your ship see and lock targets? Scan resolution is a little bit, basically it comes down to how fast can you lock onto a target. How clearly can you see? And as standard, this remote sensor dampener 1 will give you a flat bonus, negative 13.7% to both of those. And the ship that's bonus to use these modules is the Maulus from the Galente faction. And you'll see, just like the Vigil, it has effectiveness and range bonuses for these modules. But what makes this module just a little bit different and a little bit more complicated is that you can use what are called scripts with these modules. And I've also linked these in the Fleet Chat. One of them is a scan resolution dampening script, and the other is a target range dampening script. So what the scripts do is, when you install it, it takes one of the bonuses away and cranks the other bonus all the way up to the max. Say you put in the scan resolution dampening script, well, you'll no longer have any effect on the enemy's lock range ability, but you will have double the effect on their scan resolution. In other words, they'll still be able to target just as far as normal, but it'll take them a lot longer to do so. And vice versa. If you put the targeting range dampening script in there, they'll be able to lock everything up just as fast as normal, but they will not be able to do so nearly as far you'll have twice the amount of effect on their targeting lock range. Now, does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody have any questions about dampening? So now the third type of EWAR is called disruption, weapon disruption. Now this one, again, is just a touch more complicated, but not really. The only reason it's more complicated is that now we have two different modules to deal with. We have a tracking disruptor and a guidance disruptor. Now the key point here with disruption is that you have to have the right module. You have to have a tracking disruptor for the right situation, and you have to have a guidance disruptor for another situation. And that situation is, what weapons do the enemy have? Because what these modules do is they affect the enemy's weapon systems. Where the dampening affected their targeting systems, weapon disruption, unsurprisingly, affects their weapon system. So a tracking disruptor will affect turrets, so projectile weapons, hybrids, and lasers. Guidance disruptors will affect missiles, and that's basically all there is to it. The ship that is used for disruption is the Crucifier, and again, same kind of bonuses, optimal range, effectiveness, etc., etc. And just like the dampeners, these disruptors affect two different stats as standard. The tracking disruptor will affect tracking speed, that is, how fast can the turret swivel back and forth? How well can you track the target with your machine gun in the field, right? If you were to reduce this stat, it would make it turn slower. It would give you less tracking. So as the ships are flying around past each other, the weapons can't track each other very well, and they can't hit as well. It reduces the amount of damage it's able to do. Now, this is more important when you're in close fighting, brawling as they call it. Less important when you're fighting at great distances, but still can have an effect. But the other thing that these disruptors affect is the optimal range. So if you're engaged at a long distance, you want to affect their optimal range so that they can still track just as well, but they can't shoot quite as far as well. They'll do less damage at distance. And just like the dampeners, these modules work with scripts for this purpose. So for the tracking disruptors, you have either an optimal range disruption script and a tracking speed disruption script. And again, these are going to be situational, but typically you will always want to be using one script or the other. Now for the guidance disruptor, it is a little bit different because there is no tracking speed on missiles. There's only precision and explosion velocity, but the two scripts that you get with a guidance disruptor are missile range disruption script and missile precision disruption script. And I will say what is great about guidance disruptors that is a little bit different than the tracking disruptors is when you're disrupting range on a missile, it's all or nothing. So you disrupt a optimal range of a turret, they're still going to be able to do damage, just not as much at a certain range. If you disrupt their range below a certain point, they're shooting farther than their optimal now, they're going to do less damage. Whereas with a missile, it either hits or it doesn't. So if you're able to disrupt somebody's missiles below the range that they're fighting at, they are no longer doing any damage at all. So that can be really powerful. You can essentially take an entire DPS ship out of a fight. But again, sometimes you're not at those long distances. Sometimes you're in there brawling right up close to each other, in which case the range scripts might not make all that much of a difference. So the precision scripts slightly different than the tracking scripts, but ultimately the same result is that it reduces the amount of damage it does. It's just that the mechanics of missiles are a little bit different than turrets. Rather than tracking speed, you have this what's called an explosion radius. And I'm not going to dig too far into the mechanics of it, but basically, the explosion radius, if it's bigger, it'll do less damage to a given ship. And this blows up that radius. Now, does that make sense to everybody? Do I have any questions about weapon disruption? So as I said at the beginning, all of these modules are affected by optimal range and fall off range, just like turrets in this game are affected by those values. And with all of these modules, as long as you are able to target the ship and you are within a certain amount of your fall off range, you will still be doing something with these modules, right? It may be a lessened effect, but you'll still have an effect. Now the last type of EWAR, which is called electronic countermeasures, is a little bit different. First of all, we've got actually 5 different modules that can be used here. but that's only technically different modules, and I'll explain all that in a minute. But the big difference here is that this is kind of a chance-based thing rather than, you know, I'm doing something, I'm doing less of something. This is, you're either doing something or you're not doing something. It's all or nothing. So let me link the actual modules here to show you guys. Okay, so those are the 5 different types of electronic countermeasures that we're going to be talking about today. Now, it may seem like a lot, but really these are all the same modules. They just affect slightly different ships in different ways. So let's take a look at the gravimetric ECM, the first one I linked you there. Now, if you take a look at the picture in the top left of the window there, if you've opened it, that you see it's kind of a bluish color. We call this a blue jam for that reason. These all do have names. They're gravimetric, LiDAR, magnetometric, and radar. Those are technically the names, but everybody just refers to them by their color. So if you open up gravimetric, that's a blue jam in the top left there, right? You open up LiDAR, that is a red jam because of the picture there in the top left. Magnetometric is a green jam. It's kind of a bluish green. Everybody just calls it green. And radar, the last one, is yellow. If you look at the picture, yellow jam. And we'll keep radar open just as an example here. If you go to the attributes tab, down at the bottom, you'll see ECM jammer strength. And you'll notice that it has 4 different values. ECM jammer strength is the important thing that you need to be looking at here. So each one of these has 4 different values here. But you'll notice that one of them is much higher than the rest of them. And that corresponds to the color in that top left. So the radar ECM has 3.3 points in that radar ECM strength, that yellow strength, and only 1.1 in the rest of these. Whereas if you look at the magnetometric, the green jam, it has 3.3 in the green color slot, the magnetometric slot. So what this means is that each one of these is stronger at that one particular sensor type than all the rest of them. They will still affect, they'll still work against other sensor types, but they are not nearly as effective. And I'll talk about the sensor types in just 1 second. So I'm going to relink the crucifier here in chat. Go ahead and open that up and go to attributes and then scroll all the way down, and right above propulsion, you'll see sensor strength. Now you'll notice it only has 1 value, and that is in the yellow slot. Radar. EWAR ships all use radar sensors, and only radar sensors. They have no values for any of the other sensors, just yellow radar. Now the way that ECM actually works is this is a probability, and that probability is defined by your ECM jammer strength for a particular sensor divided by the ship's sensor strength, which you are trying to jam. Now what that means is if I have an ECM equipped on my Griffin, say, that has a jam strength of 10 for yellow, and the ship that I'm trying to jam has a yellow sensor strength of 10. My probability, assuming that I'm within optimal range, because like I said, we're still subject to some optimal fall off stuff. We're assuming optimal range. I have a jam strength of 10. They have a sensor strength of 10 on yellow. My probability to jam them is 100%. If my jam strength is only 9, and their sensor strength is still 10, I have a 90% chance to jam them. Still pretty high, but it is not guaranteed. So this is all to say, if your jam strength is as high or higher than their sensor strength, you will 100% of the time jam them, assuming that you're in optimal range. Now, what does jamming actually do? I haven't discussed that yet, and I'll explain it. Jamming will break all target locks and prevent the ship from locking any more targets for 20 seconds, with the exception of the ship that has jammed them. So what that means is that if you're in a Griffin and you jam some ship, they're not going to be able to target anybody else except for you. And if they have guns, guess where they're going to be pointing those guns? At you. So your job as a Griffin is going to typically be, well, I'll describe that when we get to how to fly the ships. First of all, I want to make sure that I didn't totally butcher this explanation. Does everybody understand how jamming works? Just as at the base level. Did I explain it correctly? Does everybody understand?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So yeah, Dennis pointed something out that I'm going to go over now as well. So we looked at the crucifier. The crucifier has those yellow jams, right? Or those yellow sensors, right? And the radar, the yellow jams, are bonused very strongly in that yellow category, right? So you always want to use the yellow jams against EWAR ships because they're going to be the most effective that way. Now, the easy way to remember this is if you still have that crucifier box open, or if you want to reopen it, look at the portrait of the crucifier and tell me what color is the background of that picture. It's kind of a yellowy, isn't it? Like a goldish yellow. And take a look at the Vigil. Open that up. And what color is the background of that picture for the Vigil's ship portrait? Yeah, rouge, red. Now scroll down in the attributes window and what type of sensor does the Vigil use? It uses red sensors. The LiDAR sensors. The shortcut to remember which jams you need for which race of ship is you look at one of the ship's pictures. You look at the background. What color is it? And I actually forgot to link this earlier. The Griffin is the ship that uses jams. It gets the bonuses for it. Now you'll notice the Griffin has a blue background in its portrait and also uses blue sensors. And Galente is kind of an outlier, but if you can kind of stretch it and say that's greenish. It's like half of it's kind of green, the other half's kind of brown, but it's green, and you want to use green jams against Galente ships. That's just a shortcut to remember which type of jams you need for which ship. Does that make sense to everybody? Do I have any questions about jamming so far?
Yeah, Nader, just to clarify, so the sensor strength number, so like the Mollis there, the 16, you're saying that because that number is the highest, that's the one we would use against it, the green.
Correct. Every ship in the game only has one single type of sensor. So I guess I could explain this another way. If you open up the magnetometric ECM and you look at its strengths, it has 3.3 in the magnetometric, but the way that this works is it only rolls whatever type of sensor the ship has, right? So it only rolls, when it's doing its probability calculation, it only rolls that magnetometric. It doesn't look at any of the other ones. So if you're using the wrong type of jam, it's going to roll that 1.1 against the ship's sensor strength. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Does everybody else get that?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So it only takes into account, it only looks at the ship's sensor, and then it looks at your jam and says, okay, you have that value in that particular color. So like I said, you can use any color jam for any ship, but it's just not going to be nearly as effective. And that is also true of the multispectral ECM. You'll notice that it's got even strength across the board, but it's kind of meh. It's like between the bad strength of the other ones and the good strength. It's just in the middle. It kind of just is meh. Oftentimes it's better to fit one of each color jam than it is to fit four of these multispectrals. And that's what we call rainbow jams when you have one of each. If we have any questions about any of the types of EWAR, what they do, how they work, anything up to this point, any questions?
I have a question.
Right.
So I notice a lot of our EWAR ships for ECM are fitted with like, you have 4 kind of thing, right? And that's because they're stronger, but it doesn't seem like they're that much stronger. Like it's 1.1 stronger than the multispectral. Is the multispectral that much worse as we go up?
Well, once you start looking at the bonuses of ships like the Griffin, you'll notice you have a 15% bonus to jam strength per level for Caldari frigate. So once you start stacking those bonuses up and then you start adding modules into your fit that also increase the strength, that number starts to go up quite a bit. And if you have a higher base value, you get even more strength, for those percentage bonuses. So you want to come at them with the strongest possible strength. You want to start with the highest possible base value.
I see. So it's like cascading math bonuses.
Yes. Yep, you got all kinds of bonuses stacking on top of there. Any other questions about any of the stuff we've covered so far? I'm going to get into the kind of how to fly in the next little section here.
I have a question for the ECM when a rainbow ECM. Is it generally always better to go rainbow even if you know what type of ships they're going to be flying?
No, and that's one of the points I was going to cover in the next section, but I will go ahead and just quickly say it now. You should ask your FC what color jams you want to bring. If you don't already know yourself, which is pretty likely in the big fleets, you aren't going to have any idea. You should ask. Oftentimes they'll know what ships you're going to be going up against and what colors are going to be advantageous for you.
Okay, yeah, awesome. Thank you.
And oftentimes if somebody like me or another person that's experienced with this stuff, oftentimes will speak up for you and ask and let you know. But you can either put it in fleet chat, somebody will see it. A lot of times somebody will speak up, or just, bind your shout key and mumble, because they're oftentimes in their own command channel. You need a shout key to actually talk to the FCs. But don't be shy. Ask. Say, hey, I'm flying a Griffin. What kind of jams should I bring?
So will we be doing that for the big fight tomorrow, or is it just better to have all of them?
I am probably going to be there, so I will probably ask at some point. I'm not going to be flying in a Griffin myself, but I like to take care of the new bros, and I will probably be asking questions like that if somebody else does it. So, as far as how to fly these things, well, the main goal when you're flying these things is pretty much don't get hit. I like to say that you are flying in a delicate teacup and your enemy is carrying a sledgehammer. These things have almost no HP at all, maybe like 1,000, 1,500-ish. They have no tank modules and no survivability whatsoever. So do not get shot. That's rule number one. To do that, you want to make use of distance, and you want to make use of speed, and you want to make use of your warp drive. So for distance, before you go out, look at your modules, hover your mouse over them, and see what your optimal range is, what your fall off range is. Get familiar with those numbers, and you want to hang out probably between those two values. You don't always have to be perfectly within your optimal range, but you don't want to be all the way back at the end of your fall off either. So somewhere close to your optimal, or at least in between those two numbers, is where you want to hang out. But you really don't want to hang out all that much. You want to be maintaining some speed, particularly in a 90-degree angle to the enemies. That means that's called transversal. You want to be flying, across their field of vision, as it were. So it makes it harder to hit you. But ideally, you'll be aligned to something that you can warp to, whether that is a planet, a moon, the sun, a bookmark, something. You want to be aligned to something. So the very moment that somebody starts targeting you, you can hit warp and you're gone and you're safe. And to that end, while you're flying around, if you're not being shot at, you're doing your EWAR thing, drop some bookmarks around. Drop those in the Brave Temp folder where other people can also use them. You can have people warping all around the grid. You don't ever even have to leave the grid. All you have to do is warp. Once you enter that warp tunnel, you're safe, at least until you land. This is not a ship that you'll anchor. I don't know if we have any brand new newbies that aren't familiar with anchoring, but anchoring is what most of the fleet does, where they follow the FC around very closely. You are not going to be doing that, because if you do that, you're going to be well within range of the enemies, and they're going to see that you're there. You're not going to be aligned to anything, and you're going to get shot and killed. So you're going to be flying your own ship. Once you are reasonably sure that combat is about to happen, I would recommend that you exempt yourself from fleet warp so that the FC doesn't warp you directly into the middle of the fight with the rest of the fleet. Let the main fleet engage in combat first. Let everybody get focused on each other, and then you kind of slide in afterwards and start doing your thing. You can warp to the FC at 100 kilometers back, so you have some distance between you two, or warp to some bookmark that's on grid somewhere away from the fighting. Get a lay of the land, look at how things are going, and find some other spot to warp to, right? Your goal is to get in there as safely as possible, start doing your thing, and then bounce as soon as something bad happens. And then come back and do it again. So, talking about all that, some of the specific stuff, the Vigil probably has the longest range of any of the EWAR types, the target painters. They can easily reach over 100 kilometers optimal. You're really going to be limited by your targeting range at that point. That becomes the bigger issue than your actual target painter optimal range. After that, damps and I'm not sure which one is actually longer range, damps or disruptors. They're kind of both in that middle area. Somewhere 70-ish kilometers is not outlandish, 70, 80 kilometers, something like that. And then the shortest is jams. Griffins are going to probably be more around the 50 kilometer mark, or maybe even less depending on your skills. So Griffins are kind of right in there if they want to be, more effective. So you're going to really have to be flying by the seat of your pants and being ready to warp quickly. But the cool thing about Griffins is that once you land a jam, you see that little symbol that goes solid on your target. Once that lands, that's 20 seconds. And that's regardless of whether you're on grid or not. So you can land a jam, boop, you're gone. And they're still jammed for 20 seconds. That's the cool thing. All the other ones, you have to stay on grid. And the cycles, there are cycles, but they're shorter than 20 seconds. You pretty much have to stay there continuously to keep applying your EWAR. But with Griffins, you can drive by. You show up, jam them, warp away. Come back in 20 seconds and do it again. Hey everybody, I got to pause the video here. I am currently editing, and I went back after this little section, and something in the back of my head was bugging me. So I actually jumped in game and did a little testing and found out that I was completely wrong. If you jam somebody and then you warp away, your jams are actually canceled immediately, whether or not you remain on grid. As soon as you initiate warp, your jams are lifted off of the enemy ship and they can begin targeting stuff. That is to say, you can still use it to break their active locks and then warp away, but your jam does not last for the full 20 seconds as I understood it before. So that was my bad. I was totally mistaken, and I just wanted to issue a little correction here in the video for anybody who's watching. And to anybody who came to the live class, my bad, I was wrong. Back to the video. Any questions about that stuff that I just covered? That's kind of just a real quick and dirty crash course on what you should be doing. Were there any terms that I used that are unfamiliar, or anything that you guys would want me to go over in more detail?
So you talked briefly about transversal flight, trying to stay alive and flying around them. How do you accomplish that without, say, like orbiting your target? Like, are you just screen clicking?
You can orbit your target. The way that I do it with EWAR is I look for something that I want to warp to, either a bookmark or a moon, planet, something that is kind of in that. Doesn't have to be perfectly like 90 degrees left or right or up or down, but it's like close. It's like I'm not flying directly at them or away from them, but I'm like somewhere in between, aligned to something, flying. In the case that I don't notice that I'm being shot at, maybe I get 1 or 2 seconds extra before somebody hits me because I've got that transversal, and then I can warp away and I'm safe. So really for me, it's looking for good things to warp to, and that's why it's cool if you've got a lot of EWAR ships on field. Spread out, don't clump up together. Spread out, drop bookmarks in the Brave Temp folder and use them. Use each other as warping points. You have to be more than 150 kilometers away from something to warp to it. But that's it. It's only 150 kilometers. And a lot of these fights are on grids where some fleets are, 200 kilometers apart. You could easily be 150 kilometers away from each other. You can warp to each other as long as you're in the same fleet, and you can continually drop bookmarks around the grid to warp to. So basically, the more things that you have to align to and still try to maintain some of that transversal, the better off you're going to be.
Okay, thank you.
What ships should you guys be targeting with your EWAR? Well, let's go over them one by one. So for the Vigil, like I said, the Vigil is like shining a spotlight on the enemy, right? Making them much more obvious, easier to lock, easier to shoot. You're going to be following primary broadcasts. So you'll want to have your broadcast settings set up, and that's kind of a Fleet 101 topic. I'm not going to go into super great detail on that. If anybody needs help with that, see me after this class. But you want to be following primary broadcasts, and sometimes on fleets, in particular types of fleets, you also want to kind of pre-paint the secondary if there is a secondary. Some fleets rely on what's called alpha, which is like applying instantaneous damage to kill an enemy pretty much immediately. Fleets like Tempests and Hurricanes and stuff like that. Artillery, and they'll want to be able to lock targets very quickly, and that's where a Vigil comes in handy. Because if you've got a couple of Vigils target painting your primary broadcast, they're able to lock up pretty quickly because they're frigates. Lock them up pretty quickly, get those target painters on, and then your battleships, which normally take a lot longer to lock onto stuff, boom, they're locking them like nothing. And they're able to hit them a lot easier because you've got a bunch of target painters on them. So for damps, they're going to be a little bit more situational. Like I was talking about with the scripts, it's really depending on what the fleets are doing. If they're engaging at range, 70 plus kilometers or something like that. Basically, you know, we've got a couple of Eagle fleets with rail guns shooting each other from afar. You can lock up one of the enemy ships and apply a couple of optimal range, or targeting range damps to them, and then they're completely out of the fight. They can't target your ships because their targeting range is like nothing now, and that literally takes one ship out of the fight. They're doing no damage. Can't lock a target, you can't damage it, right? But what you can also do is you can use damps against Logi. And I tend to do that when fleets are much closer together. If it seems like I'm not going to be able to damp a ship completely out of targeting, like if they're right on top of each other or they're kind of in that middle area where they might be able to lock, might not, I'll use that scan resolution script. I'll use 2 of those. And I'll target the enemy Logi ships, because Logi ships have to be able to switch targets pretty quickly. You know, they're following broadcasts for shield or armor. You know, as our FC is calling for primaries, those primaries need reps to stay alive. Well, if your Logi ships take twice as long to lock you up, you're not going to survive all that long, right? So if the fleets are a lot closer together, I'll switch my damps over to scan res, and I will use those on the enemy Logi ships. Now, one more that you could do if fleets are at range, you could also focus enemy recon ships like Hugens or Lachesis, because they rely on long-range webs and disruption, and they're really powerful ships, and if you can damp them down to where they can't target your guys' ships, you've also taken them out of the fight. And that's a lot better than taking out one single DPS ship. But it's going to be a matter of learning what those ranges are. You have to get a feel for how far those ships can typically target normally and how far you'll be able to cut that down. But the easiest way to tell is you apply your targeting range damps to one of those ships, and if you've still got your graphics turned on or turned up, you'll be able to see if they're using a web or a point or something. There'll be an animation for that, and if there's no animation coming from that ship that you're damping, they probably can't target anything, right? So disruption, that's pretty straightforward as to who you should be targeting. The enemy DPS ships, your job is to reduce their damage as a disruption ship, as a cruise fire. The question is, how do you want to disrupt their damage? Well, again, just like damps, it depends whether they're at range or right on top of each other. So if they're at long range, you want to use either the optimal range scripts for tracking or the missile range script for guidance. Now, if they're right on top of each other brawling, you want to use the tracking speed disruption for the tracking disruptor, or the missile precision for the guidance disruptor. It's pretty straightforward. Jams are also pretty straightforward. Once you've figured out which color you need, it's pretty straightforward. Again, ask the FC, ask somebody who knows what color to bring. And if they don't answer you, just bring rainbow. You'll probably be able to use all 4 colors in a big fleet. The main target for Griffins, for jams, are Logi. Just like I was talking about with the damps, Griffins jamming Logi is really, really effective because, one, they cannot lock up any of their friendly ships to apply reps for 20 seconds if you land a jam on them. They cannot do anything. You've taken them completely out of the fight, made them useless. And 2, they don't have guns to shoot you. They have drones a lot of the time, but they can't shoot you directly. They have to send their drones all the way over to you, or they have to tell the FC that you're jamming Logi. That can be pretty bad. You know, if the FC is on top of things, he's going to primary you pretty quickly. And that's why you got to be ready to warp away. But you can be an enormous menace to the enemy Logi. And I say this as somebody who flies Logi quite a bit. It's incredibly irritating and it's super frustrating, but it's also really effective when you're the one doing it. So if you're going to be flying Griffins, I really urge you to learn the names of the Logi ships and which race they are. Like I said, the FC is going to call those jam colors based on what kind of Logi they have. Yeah, you always want to be targeting them. If there's no Logi left on field, by all means go for the DPS or whoever, but always go for Logi first. All right, I see we have one question from Dennis. Go ahead, and then we'll take other questions as well.
You kind of answered it with your last statement there. I just wanted to know, like, how do we identify Logi at a glance? Is it always just like ask the FC, or is it, you know, is there a way to tell with your eyes?
Well, that's something that kind of comes with experience. You can look it up, and I'll tell you right now the names of the Logi ships. So the big ones that you want to focus on are the T2 Logi ships. So if you've got red jams, that is a scimitar. If you've got blue jams, that is a basilisk. If you've got yellow jams, that's a guardian. If you've got green jams, that's an Oneiros. There's also T1 Logi, which are the same. Red jams would be a scythe. Blue jams would be an osprey. Yellow jams would be an augurer. And green jams would be an executor. And that's it. Those are the 8 ships. You want to focus on those T2 ships first because they're much, much more powerful than the T1 variants. And taking them out of the fight is huge. But that's just something that comes with experience, learning those names. And if you're using ZTAC-S overview, there is actually a preset, I think in the target tab or combat tab, one of the tabs. You can set it to show only Logi ships. Now that's only going to show you the T2 Logi, which is what you really want to focus on anyway. But if you run out of T2 Logi or you have the wrong jam color or something, you want to focus on T1 instead, you'll have to kind of sort through manually to find those. But you can set your overview to just show you logistics cruisers. Any other questions about that little section we covered there?
Just real quickly. So you said for the T1s, it was Scythe, Osprey, Augurer, and what was the 4th one?
Executor. That's the Galente T1 Logi. And these are all cruisers. I haven't touched on the frigates because Logi frigates they're used in mostly destroyer fleets or frigate gangs, but they're not nearly as common on big stratops like we have coming up tomorrow. So it's pretty much always going to be cruisers for big fleets. But the same thing applies if you're in a frigate gang or destroyer gang going against another one. You still want to target their Logi. You're still going to want to familiarize yourself with the names of those ships and look out for them. Any other questions about that little section there? Okay. Now I did have one last thing about kind of the mechanics of how all this works, and that is diminishing returns or stacking penalties, which some of you guys may have run across on some other stuff, maybe while you're fitting up a ship. Gives you a warning that you've got stacking penalties. Well, the same thing applies to EWAR, at least for the first 3 types: target painting, dampening, and disrupting. It's essentially diminishing returns, as in the more modules you stack onto one single target, the less effective each one is going to be. And that break point is typically, I think, 4 or 5 modules is like the maximum. And then after that, it's pretty much useless to put any more on there. So if you've got 2 Molluses, each one of those probably has 2 damps. You know, those 4 damps are going to be just about as much as you can stack onto one single target. But kind of the standard way of combating these stacking penalties is doing what's called spreading EWAR. Now, this is kind of irrelevant for vigils because vigils will be following the primary broadcast unless there's like a lot of vigils, in which case you can just start target painting random stuff and maybe it'll be called primary. But usually there's not that many vigils. Usually, 1, 2, 3 vigils all following primary is going to be okay. But when you get into damps and crucifiers, especially if you've got a lot of them, you want to spread your disruption around. You want to spread your damping around. And honestly, you'll want to spread jams too. If you've got a lot of griffins, only one jam can land at one time. So you don't all want to try to jam the same Logi cruiser. You want to spread them out to affect all of the Logi cruisers if you can. And the way that this is typically done is you look at your name, you see what's the first letter of your name. For me, it's N, Nader, right? Now I look for a pilot in the enemy fleet that's flying the ship type that I'm looking for, and also starts with an N, or as close as I can get, right? So if I see somebody in the other fleet also starting with NAT, I'm going to go on that guy. I'm going to put both of my modules on that guy, both my disruptors or my damps or whatever, both are going on that guy, and they're going to stay on that guy until I have to warp away. Same goes for Logi with jams. You can try to find somebody with that alphabetically close to you, or you can communicate with your fellow peeps and say, hey, I'm jamming this guy. I just landed a jam, he's jam somebody else. I know on our Mumble we do have a specific EWAR channel. It's not super commonly utilized, but feel free to jump in there with your fellow EWAR pilots. Try to work together, get things going. Does everybody understand what I mean by kind of spreading your stuff out and how to do that alphabetically? Does that all make sense to you guys?
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. I'm hoping I'm explaining these things well. Now I do kind of want to... The only thing that I really can show you guys, I mean, there's not a ton of practical stuff that we can do just with each other. It's kind of a hands-on thing, but I can show you what it looks like when you land a jam, if that's something you guys want to do, because it is a little bit different when you land it versus when you don't. So does everybody have a Griffin?
Yep.
Cool.
Just swapping into one.
So I'm also flying in a Griffin, so why don't you guys put on blue jams onto your Griffins and just undock. So right now it's telling me I'm managing 0 targets, as many as I have. Actually, I have 4 jams active on me right now. But do you guys see how some of your little circles are like kind of transparent and some of them are solid? The solid means that your jam was successful. But the transparent one means that it failed. So you're not quite at that 100% yet with your strength versus my sensors. But still strong enough for you guys to jam me pretty often.
I've got some that are kind of grayed out, like they look solid but grayed out.
Yeah, and those are likely failed attempts.
Okay, so what's the difference between that one and like the kind of transparent one?
Well, if they're solid but they're grayed out, then that's probably the timer coming through. Like there will be a gray circle that goes around it as the timer completes. That's the 20-second cycle.
It looks as if it starts to flash once it's nearing the end of it as well.
Yes. Okay, I can target you 3 that are on top of me. Actually, I can target you all now. Yeah, see, I just failed on Emerzone. I got you with a green jam. But Dennis, try to target somebody else. See what happens.
Nope, can't do it.
See, that's exactly... you see why this is super frustrating as a Logi pilot. Because your only job is to lock up friendlies. You're not concerned with the enemies. But all of a sudden, you can only lock up an enemy. And you're basically useless against them. All you can do is either send your little drones after him or tell the FC and hope that the FC gets him killed. You can see why this is so effective and why we love Griffins.
I just thought, if you're being jammed by 2 separate ships, I know you can only lock on to the ship that's jamming you, but would they cancel each other out so that you can't lock anyone? Or...
No, you can lock, if you're being jammed by multiple ships, you can lock up all the ships that are currently jamming.
Gotcha.
So right now I am only jammed by, hold on a sec. So right now I'm jammed by Dennis and DeLuna. So those are the only 2 guys that I can lock right now.
So, a question. On our Brave Wiki webpage for StratOp doctrines, it says that because the Griffin is the chance-based, that fleets prefer to use another type of EWAR.
That is, I mean, technically true. I think that statement might be outdated. I don't want to, comment on what the author was thinking there, but I will say I've never had anybody say, "Hey, we don't want Griffins." They're always welcome. And like I said, as long as you're targeting Logi, you're making more of a difference than you think. And yes, it is true that it is chance based, but as long as you are, warping away, warping back, doing your thing, you can stay in the fight for a good amount of time, and you can take a lot of Logi out of the fight. I would argue that it can make more of an impact than some of the other ones, but that's just me. These ships that I've been handing out to you guys today are just dojo vigils. They're fit a little bit differently. They're kind of cheap, really basic stuff. The actual doctrine fits, if you guys want to either upgrade those or fit up some other ones for the future, are all listed on that Midges page that I just linked in Fleet Chat. That is the Midges doctrine. It is welcome on any fleet at any time, no matter whether it's the most casual fun roam or if it is the most important sovereignty call to arms slugfest. Any of those ships is always welcome on a fleet, and you will always get SRP for if you get blown up. So I would bookmark that, or at least save the fits into your in-game window so that you can look back on those and keep using them. A lot of fun to fly. I like flying EWAR. I need to do it more, but I always kind of feel like I should probably be in one of the mainline ships. That's what they want, but I think it's fun to fly EWAR, and I hope you guys enjoy it.
Yeah, I always prefer doing more support roles in games, so it sort of goes along with that.
Yeah, there's several different support roles. EWAR is one of them. The more critical ones are like Logi and Lynx, stuff like that. You'll have a lot of time to decide which one you want to go for. But so with that, are there any final questions about EWAR, the ships, the modules, the mechanics, how to fly, anything? The problem that happens in these big fights is that there are bubbles everywhere, and that becomes very difficult to navigate around with a warp drive. But that's where your micro warp drive comes in. If you get in a sticky spot, you try to burn away as quickly as possible, and then get to a point where you can warp and then come back.
If you cross one of those bubbles, like if you're warping, will it cut your warp?
So bubble mechanics could probably be a class in its own right.
Okay.
The very quick and dirty of it is it depends. So if you're on grid with a bubble and the bubble is in front of you, if you're warping to something more than 500 kilometers or 400 kilometers or something behind it, you should be able to warp straight through it as long as you're not inside the bubble. But if you warp to a point and there is a bubble behind that point, within that 400 kilometers, you'll be dragged into the bubble, at least to the edge of it. Like I said, it's really its own class, and I'm not going to be able to explain it very well here. I would urge you to look up either an article or a video detailing that.
I will.
But suffice it to say, it's very annoying to navigate with a warp drive when there's like a million bubbles on grid. And that's another thing that you just kind of get a knack for as you learn to do it. Or you realize that it's basically impossible to do and you just kind of grin and bear it, just fly around until you die. It's really up to you how you want to do it. Any other questions? All right, cool. That went a little bit longer than I thought, but I'll update that for next time. I appreciate you guys all coming out, and I hope you found this helpful and even enjoyable. Thanks for coming, and I hope you guys have a good time tomorrow at the big fight.
Oh, thank you
Thank
very
you for
much.
requests. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Nader.